a lot of people, abortion means nothing to most people until they're actually faced with an issue where a crisis in their own lives, or perhaps a crisis in their daughter's life, brings them up against what the conditions are in this state. It's about the X case, which was the first case after we put an amendment into our constitution banning abortion. It was the first case that really showed the impact that could have on an individual. This week is the 21st anniversary of the X case judgment, and the issue is in the news currently because for 21 years the state did not introduce the legislation that was required to give effect to the X case judgment. So there's no clarity about when a woman's life may be saved. The X case judgment was that where there's a real and substantial risk to a woman's life, then an abortion may be performed. The state has never defined what is real and substantial risk. We've had the Savita Halappanavar death last October as a result of her being left miscarrying over a number of days. It's something that leaves a woman open to infection. The argument could be made that her health was at risk, but that they didn't realise until too late that her life was at risk. And it's also the drawing of a line between protecting a woman's health and protecting her life that creates enormous problems in this country. And these problems really only come into public consciousness when some tragedy happens and they're forced onto the front pages. So what I want to look at today is what the X case was, because it's hard to remember. At present, we are waiting for legislation to be introduced. We've been told heads of bill will be published before Easter, and heads for bill lay out the basics of what will be in the bill, but not the final drafting. So it remains to be seen. I'll go through briefly, and at the end of that, it has what the Women's Council would like to see in legislation. There are some leaflets here which show what the Abortion Rights Campaign would like to see in the legislation as the amendment into place. In fact, looking at the figures for the referendum, of the electorate, only 54% of people went out to vote. 2/3 of those voted the amendment into place, and that means that the amendment was put into the Constitution by 36% of the electorate. In a referendum, you do not have to have more than a certain number. You don't have to 2/3 of the people voting for something. It's a simple majority. So it was possible to do that with a vote of 36% of the people. I think one of the things about the X case is if we hadn't had it, we wouldn't know that it was legal to preserve the life of a woman under the Constitution. Essentially, the Constitution is interpreted as meaning that a woman's life is balanced against that of a fertilised egg, an embryo and a fetus, even before a baby reaches viability. So it's an interesting and most unfair balance as regards women's rights. They mentioned this as the biggest case in Irish history. Actually, when Aaron was introducing me, he mentioned the Cadden case. And the Cadden case is one of the things that really established abortion as the most heinous crime in Irish society. Nurse Cadden was a midwife who was condemned to death in the mid-1950s because it was a case in which circumstantial evidence was used against her. Actually, a body was found outside her house, or outside her flat, and she had been in prison previously for performing abortion. She'd also been in prison for abandoning a baby, and she was arrested, and I don't think the evidence today would have added up, but perhaps they'd have had better ways of collecting evidence today, including DNA evidence, that she was condemned to death. She was, her sentence was, I've forgotten the word for it, but commuted is the word, yes. Her sentence was commuted, and she was placed in the Central Mental Hospital, and she died about 2 years later.
She was put into a mental hospital?
Yes.
As a punishment?
It's actually difficult to know, because even the first time she was in prison was in the 1930s. And if you actually read some of her statements over the period of years, there's a question, I think, about her mental health as well. But by the mid-50s, this is a woman who, in Irish society, had served 2 prison sentences and was trying to survive. She ran a service for people. She advertised that she treated dandruff problems and hair loss and other things. So she had a little clientele of people who came to her as a former nurse for various treatments. Any questions?
Just go on to the first one.
Most of the thing is where an issue of having or not having an abortion will arise is when someone meets with a crisis in their pregnancy. Most pregnancies do not encounter crises, but a crisis may arise in any pregnancy, whether it's planned or unplanned, for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes they're very complex personal and social reasons which may lead a woman to consider having a termination of pregnancy. Sometimes it may be a concern for the well-being of other children. We recently had a performance of women's raised stories, and one of those stories is told by a woman whose first child suffered really severe disabilities and needed 24-hour care, having to rise in the night and deal with that child. When she became pregnant again, she decided not to continue the pregnancy because doing so would mean that she could not have continued to give her first child the care that she needed. The next reason may be diagnosis of serious fetal abnormality. You may have seen there's a new organisation that has been formed by parents who found themselves forced to travel to England in cases where they were carrying babies that were not going to survive, where one of the women talking about it was talking about the fact that she was being left to come to term. So she's going to the butcher and saying, you must be looking forward to having your baby, or she comes back after the end of pregnancy and people are saying, oh, how's the baby and so on. But she's known all along that she's not going to be having a baby at the end of it all. And these people are forced to travel to England. So they are fighting for the right to have terminations in Ireland. And it means that they're forced to travel at a time when they've been expecting all to go well. They get this really shocking news and they have to find the money. It costs, there's another slide of the motor, it costs for a termination up to 9 weeks, it costs 450 euros. After that, there's a sliding scale depending on where in the pregnancy the person is. In Britain, termination is permissible up to 24 weeks. At the top end of the scale is about 2,000 euros for termination. So finding the money is a problem for many people who find themselves in these circumstances, and they're forced to travel without family and without support. Financial worries can be another issue. We've had a whole range of cuts which have hit families particularly, and particularly where people may already have 3 or 4 children, sometimes having a further child. In fact, even when you have fewer than 3 or 4 children, having a further child may impose a burden that families simply cannot support. There may be pre-existing health problems in women, including mental health problems, but also sometimes heart problems, kidney problems, a whole range of health problems in which pregnancy may involve a certain amount of danger, and cancer is perhaps one of the major reasons why women with health problems will seek terminations. We had a case of a woman who's now dead, Michelle Hart, who went to the press in December 2010. She was suffering from cancer. She was having a new treatment in Cork University Hospital. She became pregnant accidentally. Her treatment was stopped because the company involved didn't allow the treatment to be given to pregnant women. She and her doctor, according to her account of what happened, discussed termination, and he put her case forward for discussion in the hospital. It went to the hospital ethics committee, which refused permission. And she and her partner had to borrow the money, go to England, and in her account, I think it's he who says, we didn't even have the money for a taxi. They had to get a bus from the airport to the centre, and then what usually happens is if people have the termination in one day, they then walk around until they can get the plane back. You know, people do suffer incredible emotional, psychological and physical problems as a result of being forced to travel. There may also be relationship issues. You sometimes see women talking about the fact they made the decision because the relationship with the person with whom they've become pregnant suddenly comes to an end, and they feel they do not want to continue to have something that will hold them to that person. It can happen with a woman maybe who's suffered violence from a partner and who's raped, who knows that she will not want to have that person have a further hold on her and a further association on her. And it is an association that continues for life. And motherhood, taking on motherhood, is something that you take on for life. And people do need to consider all of the issues that are involved in that undertaking. Now, the next slide just shows you a little bit of the reality. The most recent figures show that about 4,200 women travel every year from Ireland. That means 12 women travel a day. So as we're sitting here, we know about 12 women are getting ready to travel, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow morning. Around 6 a week travel from the Cork area. So this is not some kind of occasional and unimportant medical issue. More women will have abortions and will have appendectomies. Yes.
How do you get the figures?
The British government collects the statistics on Irish women who travel for abortions, and the Dutch also collect statistics.
So they have to identify themselves, their nationality.
We only know those who have identified themselves. There may be other Irish women who have not identified themselves as Irish and who are not included in these figures. These are the minimal figures.
Well, I don't know. When somebody goes for an abortion, do they have to give their name,
The British
age,
yes.
and nationality?
You must remember that a lot of these abortions on UK citizens are done free.
Not for Irish women. Yes,
No,
they're all
no,
done in
so
private clinics.
That would be
yes.
part of it, identifying who you are and where you're from, because you have to
Yes.
give your GP number and things like that,
Yes.
your national health number. So, you know, that would be free. So if somebody's paying in euros, well, it's a bit obvious, isn't it, where they're from.
They actually are not entitled.
She's not going to want to give that information, is she? So
Well, some women don't, so that's why we know these are only minimal figures.
Yeah, okay.
There will be people who don't identify themselves as Irish. I think it's more common now to identify yourself than not. It used to be less common, but the figures are also falling. In 2001, 19 women a day travelled, and the figure was over 7,000. And we think the reason why there may be a couple of reasons why they're falling. One is that since the beginning of the 2000s, the state has been more open about access to information on contraception. It set up positive options, for example, and I suppose as a nation we've become a little more open about things like contraception. We're still not great on sex education, but there's another thing, and that is that it is possible for people to order an abortion pill over the internet. The state has seized many packages coming into Ireland, and there is a possibility that one reason why there's some fall is that there are people who are accessing the pill over the internet. Now that pill is dangerous in that it's only usable up to 9 weeks. Sorry.
Are they not seized by customs?
They are, yes. About 1,600 packages were seized the year before last by customs. They're very identifiable, and apparently once the post office gets to know what something looks like, they will seize it. I'm actually rather concerned about people importing this pill because it has to be used within 9 weeks of the beginning of a pregnancy. It causes a miscarriage, and if it's used later, then a person may cause themselves really serious harm because the size of the fetus that they're trying to pass is much bigger. It's not going to come away in the way that it will in the earliest stages of pregnancy. And there is a danger that if someone is performing something that's considered criminal, then that person will be afraid to go and get help. Now, I think that would be a major concern that I would have about people trying to do something illegal in this country, the consequences and the fear of getting help afterwards.
You also mightn't be guaranteed to get proper pills either. You might be getting knockoffs or
That's
you know,
right.
pseudo
That's
pills.
a very important point as well. Very important. If people order something on the internet, they have no guarantee at all of what the content of that may be. So I think that is a
the
concern.
main reason why it was passed in the UK. It wasn't just a case of choice. It was a case of women would go anywhere. And
That's right.
one of my grandmothers was a midwife, and they would immediately ask somebody who thought they might get some help, and there was people making potions. I myself was offered, because I was pregnant accidentally, quinine by my
Yes.
matron in the hospital.
Yes.
She said to me, "I do want this baby." I said, "Well, look, we're going to get married in January. Would you bring it forward?"
Yes.
It's not a problem.
Yes.
And she said, "Well, I can give you some quinine." I said,
Yes.
"Yes."
Well, that's
So you
interesting
see,
because
these
quinine
things
was
were,
used.
it's always gone on, and I think they realised that it was going to keep going on, and more people were going to get ill, and it was the consequences of what it was costing the National Health Service to tidy up the mess.
Yes.
They thought, hang on, we need to do this.
Yes, that's true. In the early 60s, you had around 30 to 40 women in prison every year for performing illegal abortions. It really was a huge issue, and even as early as 1938, there was a study of illegal abortion in Britain that indicated that it was a massive issue. Yes,
There's a film, Vera Drake.
that's right.
What's your opinion on it?
It's very accurate. It's the kind of woman who performed abortions. There's a woman whose name I've forgotten. She lived in Belfast, and she was Mary Stokes established a clinic in Belfast when contraception was banned in the southern states, and there was a woman who was the secretary of the clinic who then went on to do a study in which she interviewed. That's how I know the numbers of women in prisons, because she interviewed women in prison. And I gather that when that film was being made, the research that she did was one of the things that they used to pull together an accurate account of the life of a very ordinary woman. And many of these women were very ordinary women who maybe found out through self-abortion how to do it, and their neighbours would come and they would fulfil what was being asked of them. We've had cases in Ireland. There was one case in the late 1940s, which is a little bit like the Vera Drake case, where a local woman had was kind of known in the area for being able to do something for you if you were in trouble, and there were about 10 cases brought against her involving separate women for whom she had performed abortions. I think we forget in Ireland that we haven't really been so hugely different from other countries. We've also had backstreet abortions. We've had infanticide in enormous amounts. And where we're sitting here, we're not too far from a house where an infanticide occurred and a house where there was an abortion death. So I think we forget our history of these issues, and partly we do not know a lot about these issues because so much is secret about what happens during pregnancy and childbirth and so on. I think for me it was a revelation to find that if a woman was miscarrying over a number of days, she was likely to develop sepsis and might die, because I learned that through hearing doctors talking about the Savita Halapanava case. And yet I'm meeting women who are sent home to miscarry over a number of days rather than being given the kind of termination they've had in other countries.